Good morning, everyone. Join me and take your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2. That's where we'll begin here in just a moment, Exodus chapter 2. While you're turning there, I just want to let you know how glad I am that you're here. I hope that so far our worship and our study has encouraged you, and I hope it will continue to encourage you. You being here is an encouragement to me and to all of us. Exodus chapter 2. It's a lot easier to have faith when we're a child. It's a lot easier to trust things that we may not understand. One of my favorite memories as a child, probably what we would call one of the core memories that we all have, was growing up. My grandparents, my dad's mother and father, he was a preacher for 52 years in northwest Alabama, and they had a cattle farm, and they lived about an hour and 15 minutes from us. To get to their house, you had to go through Moulton, Alabama, and then you would go through the Bankhead National Forest, pop out in Double Springs, go back on some country highways, and end up in the little town of Natural Bridge. Going through the Bankhead National Forest is really enjoyable during the day, especially around the fall time. It's beautiful to drive through there, but just like any other national forest, it is filled with curves and twists and winds. That was my favorite trip to go with my dad on for a number of reasons. One of which was, it was normally just he and I. And as we would travel, there were certain things we got to do that we didn't get to do when Mom and my sister were with us. One of them was, we could roll the windows down and hear no one say, "My hair's going to get messed up." Nobody cared about your hair when it was just me and Dad going through the forest. So we'd roll, and to this day, I still love to ride in the vehicle with the windows down. It reminds me of those drives with my father. There was a Chevron station right before you entered the Bankhead National Forest, and they had Hunt's Brothers Pizza. And my dad, every time we would go visit my grandparents, we would stop at that Chevron station. We would get to pick out some drinks, some candy, and we would share a slice of Hunt's Brothers Pizza. That was a core memory. I loved that opportunity. In addition to that, when it's two men traveling, be as discreet as possible, you don't have to stop to use the restroom like you do when you have women. So we had this spot in the Bankhead National Forest because we were men. We got to stop there to use the restroom versus having to stop at a store. Those is one that memory, that traveling is a core memory to me. It's something I remember and I cherish. But one of the difficult things is you had to travel through the Bankhead National Forest to get there. We often traveled during the day. But when we would come home, we would often travel at night. Now, I don't know how many of you have to travel through a heavily wooded area at night, but as a child, driving through a heavily wooded national forest at night was scary. Sometimes Dad would tell scary stories to really amp up that fear, but there were many times where I would sit in the passenger seat and I would watch my father drive, and it was almost like he could see so much further than I could. I could see where the headlights stopped, but it felt like he could see around the next curve. There was a sense of safety that I felt in the passenger seat, that he could see something I couldn't see. It was easy as a child to have faith. Now, as a grown man, I know what shoes my dad stood in. I know what he felt, and he felt just what I felt. He had a little bit more experience under his belt. But it was easy to have faith because I felt like my father knew what was coming, what was around the corner. Exodus chapter 2. We left off in chapter 1 last Sunday studying about the Hebrew midwives who chose to do the right thing. They let those babies live, they went against what Pharaoh said, and they made the right decision. We pick up in Exodus chapter 2 this morning, verse 1, where we read of the birth of another child. But this child's not left nameless like the children that we read about at the end of chapter 1. We learn the name of this child, and we learn about the situation in which he came to life. Now, what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes in Exodus chapter 2 actually spans 80 years in the life of Moses. But just for a moment, we're going to study these different portions of his life. So let's together read Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. We're going to read the whole chapter, and then what we're going to do for the lesson this morning, we're going to go back and look at a couple of facts of the story of Exodus chapter 2, and then at the end, hopefully I plan to give you the point of application that I think ties this whole story together, what the point of Exodus 2 is. So let's read our text together. We'll look at a couple of facts here, and then we'll dive into the main point. Exodus 2 and verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him there 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. He said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" And he answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs and watered their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. In Exodus chapter 2, we see the story of Moses' birth, and we follow Moses from the time of his birth all the way until he's 80 years old. I'm going to show you where the text tells us that later in the New Testament. But we look at 80 years of Moses' life. What I'd like to do for the next few moments is go over a number of facts we find in this story, and then take those facts to draw out our main point of application this morning. Let's talk about fact number 1. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, we read about the birth story of Moses. We meet his parents, we meet him, we meet his sister, we meet Pharaoh's daughter, as well as Pharaoh's maids, and we learn what happened in not only the first 3 months of Moses' life, but ultimately the first 40 years of Moses' life. Now, I don't know about you. If you have been able to have children in your life, you know that there is associated with each child a story surrounding their birth. I could sit up here this morning and tell you the stories of all 3 of our children. Each one of them came into this world with different complications. Each story has its own interesting ups and downs, and each one brings about certain memories. With Moses, the same is true. His story of his birth is filled with a number of different memories that his parents probably carried for many years. One of them is that in the midst of his birth, we read last week that in Exodus chapter 1, the Pharaoh over Egypt had commanded that all the boys that were born would be killed, and that the Hebrew midwives had to kill them. When that didn't work, Pharaoh said, okay, since the Hebrew midwives are not killing them, all the Israelite women, when you have a child that's a boy, you have to toss your child into the river. The Nile River, filled with many predators, and obviously the child would not live. I don't know all the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the pregnancy of Moses' mother, for whom we don't have a name yet. We'll get her name later in chapter 4, and in chapter 7 we learn both the name of Moses' mother and father. But we don't have her name yet. And I don't know how that went. Many of you probably have had this experience. When you find out that there's a pregnancy, there's normally a conversation that happens between you and the spouse. And you let them know, hey, I have become pregnant. We're going to expect a child. And sometimes that's filled with a lot of tears. Sometimes that interaction is filled with a lot of happiness, and sometimes people will take it and post it on Facebook and they'll have a big reveal for it. I don't know how all that happened in everybody's lives if you've had children, but I know that that's probably not the way it happened with Moses' mother and father. I don't know how they felt, but they knew that having a child was a 50-50 chance that that child was going to have to be killed. Now, I know in today's modern society, we know what the gender of a child is before it's born. I mean, you can learn very, very early now. Morgan and I did with 2. The last one we decided not to. It was a very great experience for us as parents, not knowing that when Asher was born. But they obviously wouldn't have been able to know that then. The old wives' tales would have been the only way to try to figure that out. Could you imagine the amount of tension that would have existed in that family? I wonder if Moses' mother and father prayed that he would be a girl. I wonder if they prayed, Lord, please don't let this be a boy. Because they knew what would happen if it was a boy. And they knew what would happen if it was a girl. The girls were allowed to live, the boys were not. Moses' first moments of existence after his conception, when his life began in the womb, were filled with probably a lot of tension. And we read through the story, we find that pregnancy was probably accompanied with fear, but at the birth, the fear was realized. This is a boy. And the text tells us in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 2 that she was able to, Jochebed, Moses' mother, was able to hide Moses for 3 months. Now, many of you have been around newborn babies. Now, that's actually kind of easy. You know, a lot of people say when a new child comes into your life, it wrecks everything. Little babies are most of the time simple. Sometimes they'll have, maybe a touch of colic and there'll be other problems associated with it. But a child that's born normally, the first couple of months are quite easy. They sleep, they eat, and they do the other thing babies do in a diaper. That's all they do, right? Children that are that small are normally kind of easy. You can keep them quiet pretty easily. But, as a child grows and gets a couple of months old, you can't really do much to keep a child quiet. You can't really try to force them to be quiet. They're going to make the noises they want to make. And after 3 months, Jochebed realized Moses can't be hidden anymore. And so, in an attempt to try to save his life, she did what Pharaoh asked, but not in the way Pharaoh asked it. You see, Pharaoh said all the baby boys had to be tossed into the Nile River, and she put him in the Nile River, yes. But she made a couple of precautions beforehand. She made him a boat, a small little carrier. And if you look at the text, the Hebrew word for boat, or in verse 3, she made a basket in the ESV. That word basket is the same word used for the ark over in Genesis chapter 6. She made him a tiny ark, and she covered it to waterproof it, and she put him down in the Nile River. Now we read in this text that she did that, hopefully in an attempt to save his life. We're going to compare some New Testament passages to see that truth. But Jochebed really seemingly didn't have a choice. What was she going to do? If they found the baby boy, they were going to be in control of what happened to him. So, hey, I'm going to take things into my own hands. I'm going to try to do what is right. As she put him in the Nile River, Moses' sister Miriam, we learn her name later, stays to see what happens to him. I don't know why Jochebed didn't. Maybe it's the case of Hagar, who said, I couldn't bear to see my son die over in Genesis, but maybe she could not bear to see what happened to him, but Miriam did. Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe, and she finds him, and in an act of compassion, Pharaoh's daughter sets herself apart from her father. She hears the cry of the child, and God uses the tears of a baby to soften the heart of an Egyptian princess. And so, in an attempt to find out what to do, Moses' sister steps in. She says, would you like me, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, would you like me to go find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child? Now that might sound odd, but remember the circumstances that the Hebrews were in. There were probably many mothers whose sons had to be thrown into the river. And so there would have been ample women who could have nursed this child. But it's interesting how God works. That Miriam brings the son of Jochebed back to Jochebed to nurse him as he grows. Now it's interesting to me, in the birth story of Moses, we see one of the great instances of the point of this story. This story is wrapped up in faith. The birth story of Moses is wrapped up in great measures of faith. Think of the faith of those that trusted that God was at work. that God would work these things out in the way that they should. The two parents, the older sister, God worked in the heart of a tyrant's daughter. God worked in the heart of a mother, and all came out the way that God intended it to. Now you look at this story, just this first fact of Exodus chapter 2, and we couldn't even ourselves orchestrate such a great salvation that you see happen to Moses. And God made all that happen in the way it should. Fact number 2 of the story, Moses grew up. Now there's just a small detail in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11 that says, one day when Moses had grown up. There's a lot. That's a very filled statement in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11. Ellis, would you bring up in the ESV Acts chapter 7 verses 21 and 22? Moses grew up in the home of the most powerful man in the world, and the Egyptians were extremely intelligent. Acts 7 verses 21 and 22 says, when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. The Egyptians have been historically known as a very intelligent people. You think about the Egyptians and what they're known for: mathematics, astrology, architecture, medicine, music, law. The Egyptians were extremely advanced. And many of us are familiar with their knowledge. You think about the advances of the knowledge they had in medicine. Egyptians had dentists, and they practiced dental work. Egyptians were very far ahead in the area of architecture. Many of you have probably seen the pyramids. Some of you may have been able to visit them before. You know, they're so amazing. People now think the aliens built them. Okay, so that's how impressive pyramids are. Some of the stones, maybe over 2 million stones, make up one pyramid, and some of the granite stones close to the center where the pharaohs would have been buried weigh almost 25 tons. These were amazing feats of architecture, and the Egyptians were far advanced. Moses was brought up among the Egyptians, and the text in Acts chapter 7 and verse 22 says that he was instructed in the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was mighty in his words and his deeds. So Moses grew up. Just a short section. Moses in Exodus chapter 2 verses 11 through 14 does something odd. As Moses grows up, we're going to read here in just a second, have ready for us Acts chapter 7, verses 23 and 24, but don't put it up yet. In the text of Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, we read that Moses grows up, but that he went out, in verse 11, to his own people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses goes out among the Israelites. So if you'll pull up Acts 7, 23 and 24, we learn that at this time, when Moses goes out, he's 40 years old. So from verse 10 to verse 11, 40 years in Moses' life has passed. He was 40 years old, and it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. Moses knew who he was, and he knew where he came from. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. Moses comes out to the people of Israel in Egypt, and he is heartbroken over the labor and the suffering that they're enduring. He went to see his people. That word see is a word that doesn't just indicate to view them, but to see them with emotion. He was overcome. This was a deeply personal experience to see his own people being punished and enslaved. Now you know how this word is conveyed. You've maybe experienced this before, like a woman with some ice cream in front of the television, watching one of those commercials about the dogs in the pound, and the Sarah McLachlan music is in the, she's just weeping over these dogs on the television screen. Some of y'all are looking at me like I'm crazy. I know y'all have watched the pound commercials before, where the dog, they look so terrible and they're dirty and in the arms of an angel. Y'all have never seen that? Okay, that's what I'm talking about. That's how Moses saw his people. He was filled with emotion over their suffering. He was pulled at his heartstrings. Moses' mistake, though, is that he takes matters into his own hands. If you still have Acts chapter 7 for me, Ellis, we'll look at verse 25. Moses goes out to the people of Israel, but he didn't just go out on a whim. He didn't just, I should go see the people of Israel. I'm going to go check on the slaves. No, Acts chapter 7 and verse 25 tells us that Moses went out there, and he had the intention of leading a rebellion against Egypt. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. He saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew. He was overcome with anger. He looked this way. He looked that way. He took the Egyptian's life, and he assumed that the Israelites would come up in arms and their rebellion would take over. I don't know how all that worked out, but Moses obviously knew that God was going to use him for something special, to bring the Israelites freedom. And yet that's not what happened. Because if we continue to read in Exodus chapter 2, we learn that he comes back the next day, hoping that the people have rallied. And he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he asks them, "What's wrong with y'all? Why are you putting your hands against your companion? Why are you beating your companion?" And the man says, "Who made you our judge? Who made you our prince? You going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And Moses realized his time had not yet come. Acts chapter 7 tells us that Moses intended to lead the revolt at this time, but he killed the Egyptian. And did you pick up in the text what Moses did when he killed the Egyptian? Right? We do this sometimes when it comes to sin. This should be a dead giveaway. If I'm about to do something and I have to go, probably shouldn't do it. Right? If I have to look this way, anybody looking? Look this way, anybody looking? Probably something I should stay away from. Moses looked this way. He looked that way. Took the Egyptian's life. Now, he probably would have been fine in the courts of the Egyptians. I mean, he was an Egyptian prince. He was among the court of Pharaoh. He probably could have weaseled his way out of it because he was high in position, but he didn't tell anyone about it. And then it was discovered. And then Pharaoh realized what he had done. And then Pharaoh, in anger, tried to take Moses' life. And so Moses had to run. Moses, however, did all this in faith. He was very overcome by the mistreatment of his people. In just a moment, Ellis, we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. Moses, when he comes out and sees the Egyptian, is overcome with this sadness, and in faith tries to release and bring up this rebellion of God's people against the Egyptians. But it wasn't time for that yet. There's a lot of indicators why, and we're going to see next week when we study Exodus chapter 3. God was not going to just bring the Israelites out of Egypt at any old time. He was waiting for the sin of the Amorites to be completed before they could ever go back into the promised land. That's a promise made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. There was a time for this. God knew the people of Israel would be in bondage. God knew there would come a time in 400 years that he would bring Israel out of Egypt and he would deliver them to the Canaan land. And there was a plan to make this happen. The problem is Moses tried to circumvent God's plan and take matters into his own hands. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he was grown, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses comes back the next day, tries to break up the scuffle. His own people reject him. He isn't their judge. He isn't their prince. And the fact that he had killed the Egyptian is known, and so Moses runs for his life. But he did all of it in faith. He was trying to rescue God's people. He was wanting to deny the prosperity of being in the place of an Egyptian and go down among his people, but God's plan was not ready for that yet. And so Moses ran. And that's what we find in our next fact of the story. Moses runs. In Exodus chapter 12, verses 15 through 21, Moses takes off. He goes out and he finds by the well the daughters of the priest at Midian. Moses runs from Egypt to avoid death because it apparently wasn't God's time to do this saving of his people. And Moses is 40 years old. He sits down by this well. And when he sits down by the well, you're going to notice a theme when we study through the life of Moses. Moses sees an injustice being done. Now, Moses feels a certain way towards injustice. You see it when he sees the Egyptian beating the Hebrew. He hates it. He can't stand it, so he kills the Egyptian. He's ready to lead the rebellion. He comes out and he sees Hebrews fighting against one another. He can't stand it. Why are you going against your own brother? He comes out to the well, and the daughters of the priest of Midian come, and they begin to draw water, and then the shepherds that are local to that area come. Now, I studied a lot on this because I tried to figure out what exactly happens in this text here. Because it's not extremely clear when you read it immediately, but as you dig a little bit deeper into some of the history of the people of this area, what seems to happen, most scholars agree, is that the daughters of the priests of Midian would come to the well, and they would begin to draw out water, and they would fill up their troughs for their animals to drink. And then the local shepherds would come by and realize that the daughters of the priests of Midian had drawn all the water, so they'd drive those girls off. They'd enjoy the water for their own flocks, and then they'd take off. Guess what? They didn't have to draw no water. Now, this seems to be a pretty regular occurrence. But when Moses is watching it happen, he refuses to allow these shepherds to take advantage of the daughters of the priest of Midian. And so he drives the shepherds off. He draws out water for the girls, lets their flocks drink, and then the girls are on their merry way. They get home, and the dad says, apparently this happens all the time, "Why are y'all home so early?" And they say, "A man drove off the shepherds, and he drew water for our flocks." And the I don't know if he's a matchmaker or, he really just wanted one of his daughters to get hooked up with this guy, but he liked the way this guy operated. He said, "Well, where is he? Why'd you leave him out in the cold or out in the wilderness, in the desert? Why'd you leave him? You need to bring him home. Invite him in." And what happens is Moses ends up marrying one of the daughters. But Moses could not stand for injustice to take place. We do learn one thing about Moses, though, when he goes into the wilderness, is Moses begins to learn some lessons already. You remember what happened when Moses saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew? Moses allowed his anger to get the best of him, and he took the Egyptian's life. Sometimes it takes violence for us to learn how to control anger. Moses could well have said, "You don't know how much violence it took to teach me gentleness." But in this case at the well, he learned. He didn't take the shepherd's life. In fact, Moses drove them off and allowed them to live. Moses is starting to learn his lesson, I think, about how to deal with people. Some lessons that God's going to probably use when Moses is in charge of a great number of Israelites later. So he didn't kill the shepherds. Moses learned the most valuable lesson of leadership here. He served these women in verse 19. So, in Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, our last fact of the story, Israel prays. Now, if you're somebody that underlines in your Bible, here's a good passage to underline. Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. 4 words that are going to continue to come up in Exodus. God heard their groaning. God remembered that he had a covenant with them. He saw the people of Israel and he knew. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. Those 4 words are going to continue to come up in this book, and they're very important. God heard the prayer of the people of Israel. The Pharaoh has died. Israel is praying, and we're going to learn in our next text, next week in Exodus chapter 3, that Moses, at this point at the end of chapter 2, is 80 years old. That's all the facts for the story. Let's talk for a minute. Here's what we got. Moses is born. Moses is adopted. Moses runs. Moses begins a brand new life. And then God hears the prayers of Israel. The entire story of Exodus chapter 2, if we were to sum it up into one statement, I believe, is it is a story of faith. We learn in Hebrews chapter 11, and we read some of these passages already. The Bible says in Hebrews 11 that Moses' parents had faith. Hebrews 11 says that Moses had faith. We see that the people of Israel, after being in captivity for a very long time, just from the time Moses was born until now, at the end of chapter 2 is 80 years, they had faith because they still prayed to God. And when you and I pray, we don't pray for nothing. We pray because we expect God to hear us. We want God to hear us. We want Him to answer our prayer. Exodus chapter 2 is a story that is about faith. You think of the faith that Moses' mother and father had to have when they decided to hide him for 3 months. That's what Hebrews 11 says. And anytime a child is raised, it's an act of faith. Because a child can't be properly nourished in a home that's filled with fear. It has to be properly nourished in a home that's filled with faith. A child can't grow up to be what they should be, raised in a house of fear. A house of faith is what Jochebed and Moses' father, I think it was Amram. Jochebed and Amram raised up their child in a house of faith. You think about the faith that Moses' sister Miriam had to have. She had faith that all of this would work out. She's the only one that stood by the river. She waited to see what would happen. She had faith in God. Moses had faith. Think about the lessons he learned in Egypt. Think about the prosperity. Just, if you have time this afternoon, just research the amount of treasures they've found as they've uncovered the tombs of the pharaohs. Just the treasures that are in the tombs of the leaders of Egypt. Egypt was some of the richest people in the world at that time. They were the superpower of the world. They had everything. And Moses was living in the house of the most powerful man in the world. Some of us could say, maybe some of us would fall in the trap of saying, if we were in Moses' shoes, think about how much more good I could do in Pharaoh's house. Look at all these resources that are around me. But Moses didn't consider that his track of career development. He trusted in God. He had faith in Him. He had faith in God to run out into the wilderness because it was not time for the people of Israel to be saved. God was going to save them later. Moses trusted in God's timing. Now, at 40 years old, Moses was ready to rescue the people of Israel. He was ready. He killed an Egyptian. He was ready for the rebellion to begin. But God doesn't call him until he's 80 years old. Now, I want you to think about that. Moses is born, and it's 40 years before he decides he's going to do something. And then God has him wait another 40 years before He sends him back to Egypt. And then Moses only lives 40 more years after that. 2/3 of Moses' life was preparation for the last third of his life, which was ministry. For every year of ministering or leadering that he had, God prepared him for 2 years. You know, sometimes we have to trust in God's timing as well. You think that when Moses was in the wilderness, God didn't let him rescue the Israelites when he was 40. You think in those 40 years that Moses was in the wilderness that God probably taught him some lessons about how to shepherd people? What did he do in the wilderness for 40 years? We're going to see at the beginning of chapter 3, Moses was a shepherd for 40 years. I wonder if God was preparing him for anything. Leading a group of people through a wilderness, maybe? Moses had to trust in God's timing. Think about your own life. Do you have faith in God's timing? Do you have faith in God's plan for families? Do you have faith in God's plan that all things will work to the good of those who are called according to His purpose? That at the end of time, each one of us will step into heaven? The New Testament speaks of this, that God's timing is actually right, that God does things in the way He intends them, the way He intends them for a reason. Maybe you're in a time in your life like Moses where you're ready to do things, and maybe there's just some things you need to be learning. Right? Sometimes we count these small, insignificant moments of life to be insignificant. But God, through these small moments in Moses' life, taught him things he would need to lead the people of Israel. There may be things that you're learning in your life right now that you need for later on. And you need to be faithful to God in those moments now. The people of Israel had faith. Even after being in Egyptian bondage for years and years and years, they still trusted God enough to cry out to Him. You see, the story of Moses' birth in Exodus chapter 2 is a story of faith. The faith of parents, the faith of siblings, the faith of a man named Moses, the faith of the people of Israel. It's a story of faith. And these people trusted that God's plan, that He is sovereign, His plan is what would come to fruition at the end. So, for your life today, do you have that kind of faith? Growing up, I didn't know what was around the corner in the Bankhead National Forest. I didn't know. He told me a story one time about bears dragging people into the woods. I thought the bear was going to be around the corner and drag me into the woods, okay? I thought that was what was going to happen. I didn't know what was around the next corner. But I felt like he did. And so I trusted him. You know what I did 9 times out of 10 when we would drive back home through that forest? Like any kid in the car, I'd lay my head over and I'd go to sleep. Because I trusted that he knew what was around the corner. In this story, I see parents and siblings and a leader and a nation that trusted that God knew what was around the corner. And we're going to see as we read through this story that He does. Everything in this is brought about for His glory. So maybe our faith in the Lord could be stronger like Moses's. Maybe our leadership could be stronger like Moses's. Maybe our faith in God's design for our life could be stronger. Like maybe his parents, Jochebed and Amram, they're the example for us. Maybe Miriam as a sibling. Maybe this morning you're not a Christian. Maybe you're not a parent. Maybe you don't work. Maybe the only thing you are this morning is a sibling. And we can learn a lesson from that as well. The faith of Miriam. Whatever the case is, I hope you'll be encouraged by Moses' faith. And if you need to have a stronger faith, to trust that God's plan, His sovereignty is real, I would encourage you to grow that. Read the stories like the stories of Moses and others in the Bible who trusted in God's plan. God's ultimate plan as we're going to see through this story, is that Jesus is very similar to Moses. Jesus came, he was not ashamed of us. He felt compassion for us. We're slaves to sin, and he did what he could to bring us out of that bondage, like Moses. Moses was a shadow of Jesus from the New Testament, and Jesus brings us out of bondage today. Do we have faith in him? I encourage you, if you don't, to work on that today, to ask questions if you need answers, to look to God's Word if you need guidance. Maybe the case is this morning that your faith has not been real or solid or even noticeable, not even trackable. It doesn't even show up in your mind, and you need to grow your faith. Whatever the case is, I would encourage you to take the story of Moses as an example and to trust God with your life. Whatever the case is, if you need to become a Christian this morning, if you need to repent of a sin that's stood between you and God, or if you just need to grow in your faith and you want the church to pray for you, we have an invitation that is set aside. We're going to sing this invitation song in a moment. If you need anything, please come as we stand and sing.